The Golden Robe, written and read by Julian Brown. The Golden Robe, Part 1. Lost and Found, or Found and Lost. At first he thought it was only a dead end, one of those areas behind stores for emptying rubbish and accepting deliveries. Surprisingly though, there was a small shop there, much like an enchanting grotto from some old fantasy novel, tucked away in the corner. Strange place to set up a shop, thought Sedgwick, unless it was one of those exclusive little cult stores known only to a few, who passed on knowledge of its existence via word of mouth. As small as it was, the shop seemed to glow. This area, away from the midday sun, seemed to create its own light, warm and welcoming. Sedgwick approached its entrance, entranced, drawn by some inner compulsion to explore this unusual shop, and noticed the ancient feel of the building. The sign above the door was like that from some old tavern from the Middle Ages, with much of the lettering missing, with only the words "Ye Old" still legible. As he entered, the sparkling sound of chimes broke the silence, adding to the mystical ambience of the store. His first impression was one of astonishment. It seemed like centuries' worth of artifacts filled this little shop. Endless shelves and tables displaying statues, dolls, effigies, talismans, masks, amulets, candles, and all sorts of spiritual instruments and regalia, all in good shape, dust-free, and gleaming in the twilight. Someone had obviously taken great care and attention to detail here, to make sure that everything displayed expressed intensely its presence and magical aspect. Bookcases full of ancient texts that were so old the covers were becoming powder flanked the walls on each side. A beautiful antique freestanding grandfather clock, complete with pendulum swinging back and forth, ticked and tocked away loudly at the rear end of the shop. There were some long robes hanging on a pole next to the pay counter. Behind this was another room, its interior obstructed by a curtain of black flowing cloth framed with Arabian lettering. Still no sight of any staff. Sedgwick called out, "Hello? Is anybody there?" He waited. Nothing. Then he saw it. The Golden Robe hung amongst a variety of different coloured robes, each one body length and hooded. The one that caught Sedgwick's eye, though, was the golden one, which seemed to be made of pure gold. Though it could be some hybrid form of cotton and plastic, the feel of it was cool and metallic, and the shine it gave off was almost blinding. Before entering this shop, he had no knowledge of this robe, but now, since spotting it, trying it on, and feeling its perfect fit as if tailor-made for him, nothing else seemed to matter apart from acquiring the golden robe for himself. "Hello?" He called out again, louder this time, eager to find out the price of this garment. Still, no reply. The relentless ticking of the giant clock reminded Sedgwick his lunch break was coming to an end soon. Maybe the shop owner had just popped out for lunch themselves and would be back soon. Seemingly so hungry, they forgot to lock up the shop. Fancy that, such meticulous attention given to each individual item on display, yet the same person had forgotten to lock the front door on their way out. He could always come back after work, he thought, to inquire about the robe. No, he had to have it now. What if when he came back later, the robe wasn't there anymore? This strange little magical gift shop, what if it disappeared as well? This seemed to Sedgwick to be a genuine possibility. He had the feeling one gets when they have to make a decision on the spot that could affect the rest of their lives. If he left the shop now, he may never again set eyes on this magnificent flowing golden robe. Sedgwick emptied his wallet on the counter, a total of £54.27. The robe was probably worth a lot more than this, so he left a note with his name and contact details explaining that he just had to have the robe and hoped that the owner would understand. If his payment offer was not enough, he would be happy to pay whatever the difference was. Sedgwick tried on the robe once more to experience the feel of it again. He felt powerful, masterful in this golden robe, as if he could do absolutely anything with it on. Oh, how wonderful life would be if he didn't have to go back to work right now. He found a tall, life-sized mirror next to the grandfather clock and lifted the hood up and over to cover his head. What a sight! Like an initiate or adept from some ancient mystery school. A playful feeling came over him as he grabbed one of the magician's wands from a batch of them and began waving it around in the mirror as if summoning some entity from the great beyond. Sedgwick lost himself in the reverie of his reflection, performing a spontaneous monologue. The words came to him easily and flowed effortlessly from his lips. Oh, how I wish I could leave this hell on earth, this mediocre excuse for a life, this dead-end, no-prospect job. Oh, what a pleasure it would be to leave this place forever, to go somewhere better, more pleasant, to not feel so lonely, to feel more appreciated. Oh, how I wish I could just disappear right now. The next day, Sedgwick didn't turn up for work. His supervisor, Laura, thought this strange, as he'd usually call in to let her know if he wasn't coming in. After the third day and still no show, Laura called Sedgwick at home, but there was no answer. Laura wasn't particularly keen on Sedgwick since he'd started working here. He was usually the last person to arrive in the morning and the first to leave at the end of the day, and was always late back from his lunch break. Not exactly the enthusiastic type, and in a daydream half the time, Sedgwick seemed unsatisfied by this role, and maybe in life in general. Yet despite this, Laura still felt somewhat responsible. She was, after all, his mentor and supervisor, and at least took her job seriously. Laura had been in the middle of writing her probationary report for Sedgwick when he disappeared. She found this a bit jarring, as she only had a couple more pages to write to get signed off. 2 weeks later, while making her way home from work, Laura decided to have a quick smoke. It had been a stressful day. Laura had managed to keep her smoking habit a secret, and as far as she was aware, no one at work knew about it. Instead of joining the unofficial smokers area outside of the front of the tube station, she took a walk across the road into a dark side street. This was her spot. She had smoked in secretly for years now, a world behind the world where bins were emptied and stock was delivered, away from prying eyes. As she sparked up, she noticed a faint warm glow towards the end of the alley. Drawn by this unfamiliar sight, she came across the mystical gift shop, a hidden oasis lighting the darkness around it. This shop wasn't here before. Surely she would have noticed it if it was. Seemingly themed around the magical folklore of ye old England of the Middle Ages, she felt compelled to have a look inside. She would save her cigarette for later. Stubbing it out on the pavement, she walked through the entrance of the shop. After looking around this mysterious TARDIS-like structure, studying the rows and rows of interesting items on display, she then noticed the Golden Robe, outstanding amongst all the other robes. Laura couldn't take her eyes off it. For some reason unknown to her, she knew she just had to have it. She called out, "Hello? Hi? Is there anybody working here? I'd like to buy something." There was no reply. Maybe there was someone behind this silky black curtain covering a doorway behind the counter. "Hello?" she shouted, aiming her greeting into the back room. No response or sign of life at all. There was some money, though, on the counter, along with a folded note, which she opened and read. Interesting, thought Laura, recognizing Sedgwick's messy handwriting seeing his phone number and name on the letter explaining his need for the golden robe. Was this the same robe she saw before her now, or a different one? And if Cedric purchased the robe, where did he go with it? These questions perplexed Laura, but felt secondary to the need she felt to acquire this golden robe for herself. Trying it on, Laura loved the feel of it on her skin over her halter top, the way it fit so snugly, as if made just for her. She noticed the mirror at the rear and some black, white-tipped wands next to it. Laura walked over to the mirror to view herself in the robe. She was met with a fantastical sight, at once beautiful and terrifying. The glow of the golden robe seemed to merge with her own natural glow, forming a vibrant field of pink-white light all around her. The classy grandfather clock reminded her that her train home was due in 5 minutes. She knew if she missed this one, she would have to wait half an hour for the next one, so she decided she'd come back the next day. Maybe tomorrow the owner would be there. Maybe they would know where Cedric had gone. She thought it strange that his money and note was just left out on the counter like that. When Laura came back to the dead-end dark path the next day, though, that's all it was. There was no mystical gift shop, no warm glowing light, and no golden robe. The Golden Robe, Part 2. They Who Rule from the Shadows. Leopold made up for what he lacked in morals and decency with ambition, drive, and business acumen. Named in the spirit of the Belgian king, who lay siege to the Congo, whom it is said by many slaughtered millions more Africans during his reign than Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Leopold, of Boston stock, was born into one of the power families on earth, the true ruling elite who manipulated reality from behind the curtain. There is a murky, mysterious world, unacknowledged by the powerful, situated in between the screens that tell us the news and the faceless forces that control what appears on the screens. In such a place, inconvenient notions such as legal and illegal have no meaning, for it is a place where there is no law. What is right or wrong here is not determined by any recognizable codes of conduct, but by how much power and influence a person has to create right or wrong as they personally see fit. Truly, such people see themselves as gods, given divine right to rule over us and impress their own ideas of good and evil on our collective understanding. False stories, staged events, massacres to grab the headlines from morning until bedtime, all projected through the distorted lens of those who see themselves as good and anyone opposing their narrative as evil. To control the public perception of right and wrong is a very useful ability to have, though it does have its drawbacks, as Leopold is soon to find out. In this lawless void, many mercenary and Machiavellian practices go on unseen. It is the undocumented chaos, connecting the dots between a decision made in the boardroom to a so-called terror attack in the capital. Wars don't happen as naturally and spontaneously as we are led to believe by our puppet media. They are orchestrated, designed, sold, and bought like any other commodity on the market, pitched to senior executives as great investment opportunities. One such exciting prospect was, and still is, the Colt AR-15 lightweight magazine-fed gas-operated semi-automatic rifle, and its deployment as the #1 choice of weapon for the school shooter. Pitched to the money men as a military-style weapon appealing to the civilian, the damaged, traumatized civilian who has either watched one too many war movies or who zones out daily on a diet of extremely violent VR video games. Vulnerable people who need support, who would be better served by some counseling and a course in emotional intelligence, are instead seduced by propagandists seeking to up the daily death toll. These people are to be found in every city, every ghetto, and every suburb in the world, and would benefit greatly from some genuine guidance and encouragement to help them release the great potential from within themselves. Instead, they are subtly yet strongly persuaded to release only the darkness of their fears and antagonisms. In much the same way that a child is groomed online, which is an apt metaphor here, for most of this psychological manipulation takes place online and is aimed at children. The traumatized civilian is groomed in a step-by-step spiraling downward process by a combination of social media algorithms and non-evasive remote control mind activation technology, until that fateful day when they go live on Instagram and start shooting up a shopping center. Citizens of the increasingly global village are encouraged to lash out violently at the world around them, to bring into physical manifestation the playground of death and pain occupying their corrupted minds. This is all very convenient also for the overpopulation problem, helping to keep the numbers more manageable. Though most conspiracy theorists would suspect this as the real motive behind such mind control methods, it would be truer to say that these murderous events are engineered to fulfill some sick fantasy in the mind of the orchestrator, with the reduction in population only being an added bonus. The figures for the profits being made by the AR-15 were incredible. Predictably, the stock price rose into the sky soon after a school shooting. Of course it would. It's only logical. What better advertisement for military-style weaponry than military-style death itself? Savage, unpredictable, inhumane, unforgiving, and impersonal. The unspoken tagline to this zombie apocalypse theme, that you would be a fool not to purchase an AR-15 under such circumstances. Leopold and his team were responsible for bringing the horror of war into the local community. Nothing sold guns like fear did. People feared most for their children, and children, still so young and impressionable, were obviously very scared, seeing their parents and teachers running around in a panic, crying and breaking down in emotional speeches on TV, arguing the case for gun law reforms. These young children were not inspired with much faith that their elders could protect them from this very real threat. The grooming process began here, to pave the way for yet more copycat school shootings to come, and so more sales of the AR-15. Leopold didn't enjoy many things, even with all his wealth, power, and influence. Though family gave him his privileges, he cared little for any of his family, and detested any time he was obliged to spend with them. Love. Leopold knew not love, only manipulation. Having someone miss him and care about him was something he found annoying. Rather, they serve their purpose, satisfy his carnal impulses, and then leave. No, what really got Leopold's rocks off was watching a story in the news trend globally about some terrible tragedy in a quiet town that had never before seen such carnage. A quiet town, often selected personally by him. To sit back with a mojito and know that all this mayhem and heartache in front of him was because of him. The cherry on top being that no one knew it and no one would ever know. Furthermore, if anyone did become aware of his nefarious activities, it was an additional pleasure to do away with such person in some way or another, either by assassination or even worse, by character assassination, which had the byproduct of eventually destroying the person completely, leaving them still alive, yet no longer living. It was so exciting, the whole thing. The way the excesses of corporate capitalism fed itself and kept feeding itself past becoming a grotesque caricature, like some blood-sucking leech which provoked yet more bleeding with its biting suck, and so was forever getting fatter and fatter, draining the life force of its host. He knew he was a parasite on the human race. Leopold wondered at times if he was actually human. He felt nothing in common with these people he saw screaming and crying, killing and dying on TV. They were to him like flies. Deep down, Leopold knew he was a very sick man, but didn't really care. He was rich enough to be sick and indulge his sick urges without feeling any need for self-improvement or some other such nonsense engaged in by the plebs. Let them improve themselves, thought Leopold. They could do as much self-improvement as they like, but none of it would stop him from stepping on them like bugs whenever the craving came. All of this, though, was not enough for Leopold, as is often the case with such men. Grooming a lone wolf shooter using a variety of covert means was a science in itself. Compared to starting wars between nations, though, school shootings were a small achievement. Imagine what it would feel like knowing that one unified nation state became 3 or 4 independent states with vicious border rivalries and constant conflict, all because of his hidden hand. To see cities reduced to rubble, and refugees by the thousands surrendering themselves to people traffickers in their desperate attempt to find safety as the bombs dropped. To see all of this, to know that he was the mind behind it, this really would be the ideal plateau for Leopold to reach in his lifetime. He still felt like a small fry. The AR-15 was becoming old hat. Yes, the gun made a lot of money, but what he and others like him did, they didn't do for money. They were already loaded. They did it for the buzz, and Leopold needed a stronger hit. This is where the arcane practices of the occult enter our story. For Leopold, in his search for something new, began to take a keen interest in the so-called dark arts. Occult simply meant hidden, and so as he was already immersed in a world of secrecy, he felt well primed to begin this new pastime. There were several secret orders that he knew of, introduced to by members of his family, but just as when he had tried out yoga, martial arts, or some similar practice requiring discipline and dedication, he couldn't manage to commit to it for long before losing interest. He'd got used to having whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it, and so considered patience to be more of a weakness than a virtue. Through the grapevine of the elite occult orders, of whose members many he was already acquainted with, from collaborating on false flag procedures home and abroad, he kept hearing about something called the Golden Robe. It was mentioned respectfully and with much the same awe-inspiring sentiment that is expressed when one speaks of the Holy Grail or the Philosopher's Stone. It seemed from his inquiries to be one of those mysterious and elusive panaceas that seekers throughout the ages have spent their entire lives trying to obtain in order to make use of its immense and immeasurable power. Legend has it that he who wears the golden robe becomes king. Of course, there were also warnings about the proper use of the robe and the need for the wearer to purify themselves before using it. Cautionary tales, the likes of which never bothered Leopold much, being the type of man who did as he pleased regardless. Consequences were for normal everyday folk, not gods like him, men who had the wealth, know-how, and networks to create whatever consequences they so desired for themselves, cared little for cautionary tales. Leopold's research led him to discover that the Golden Robe differed from other legends, and significantly so. Whereas most reliable accounts pointed to the Philosopher's Stone as a symbolic stone, the Golden Robe was more than just a symbol. It was an actual robe made of gold. He managed to track down the location of the robe, surprisingly very quickly for something which has eluded mankind from time immemorial. It had spent some time popping up in various mystical gift shops in and around the United Kingdom. Wherever this robe went, people seemed to disappear without a trace, along with the little occult shops it popped up in. The shiny gloss of myth, thought Leopold. People and shops don't just disappear. Perhaps this part of the story was symbolic, or mere marketing strategy to add value and so justify a bigger price tag. Everything came down to money at the end of the day. The last reports of the whereabouts of the Golden Robe indicated that it was in the possession of a nomadic tribe of Bedouins traveling across the Sahara Desert. Leopold's friends at NASA would give him the coordinates he would need to track down this tribe in the vast Sahara. He would send a drone ahead to pinpoint their exact location before flying in on his private helicopter to meet them. The Golden Robe. Written and read by Julian Brown. The Golden Robe, Part 3. The Meeting in the Desert. Leopold and 3 of his security detail took off from the Saudi Aramco helipad in Riyadh, eager to track down the Bedouin tribe in possession of the mysterious and elusive Golden Robe. Having received an intelligence update from Secret Service agents based around the peninsula, he found himself in Saudi Arabia now, instead of North Africa. He would have to keep his visit quiet, not wanting the Crown Prince to have any awareness of his activities, as the diplomatic situation between the Saudi royal family and the Biden administration had become very tense in recent days. Leopold's update was that these nomads were in the Arub al-Khali region of the Arabian Desert, also known as the Empty Quarter. Had the first report of the tribe traveling across the Sahara been incorrect? Could it be that this tribe were able to cover such a distance in only a few days because of the Golden Robe's power? Either this, or he was being led on a wild goose chase. Leopold was beginning to fret, feeling cravings for his soon-to-be new plaything. From the lost paintings of Van Gogh to Jewish Kabbalah books and relics stolen by the Nazis during the Holocaust, anything really that tickled his fancy. He wouldn't usually have to wait a day or two before the priceless item was in his hands. The minor inconvenience of this delay in locating it only added to his burning desire to finally embrace and own the robe. Like a young woman who rejected his inappropriately expectant sexual advances on the first date, despite his immense wealth, the need to conquer her will and reduce her to a begging, snivelling wreck became all the more apparent. Leopold was not a man who would accept no for an answer. Everything was his for the taking, and this robe would be no different. Luck seemed to be on his side, as just as he had this thought, the helicopter's pilot alerted him to the black dot on the horizon. The sun was high in the sky, above the vast expanse of the Arabian sands. Everywhere, sand. All you could see were the sand hills and valleys, ethereal, ghost-like, and golden in the midday sun, igniting Leopold's enthusiasm for the robe ever more. Now you may think to yourself, how foolish to choose to fly out into the middle of the desert at high noon, when the sun is at its most high point in the sky and at its most hot temperature. And you would be right in most cases. Leopold's private chopper was air-conditioned though, and so efficiently that he had to ask the pilot to turn it down as he was feeling too cold. As they neared the dot on the horizon, beautiful music played in his mind, as if from some muse of the desert. It was calming, reassuring, mystical, like a binaural beat healing frequency, and at the same time epic, orchestral. No one else in the vehicle appeared to hear the music but him, though he couldn't really tell and didn't ask. The music seemed to get louder as the helicopter came closer to reveal the black dot as a tent, with 7 camels resting outside. Not the tent that is likely to come to mind at mention of the word. This tent was more like a small palace. 'Twas a noble structure, to be sure, an illustrious gazebo, perfectly round from the sky, draped in black shiny cloth, with gold lettering and intricately woven motifs and symbols. A few men dressed for the weather, holding AK-47s, came out to meet the landing party. Covered head to toe in brown and beige flowing fabrics, only the hands and the eyes of the troop were unveiled. Leopold instructed his security detail to keep their weapons concealed and leave the chopper empty-handed. He wanted to make it clear to these armed desert dwellers that he came in peace. He himself would carry the briefcase with the offering. The helicopter landed, and the 3 security men in black got out first, followed by Leopold, holding his hands up in a "we come in peace" gesture. He told the pilot to keep the engine running. The Bedouins kept their guns pointed to the ground as they slowly approached to meet the new arrivals halfway. Now they were standing square on each other. The agent standing to Leopold's right was also an interpreter and had been specially chosen for this trip. He greeted the men first with "Assalamu alaikum." As he continued, he was brought to an abrupt halt by one of the head-wrapped men, who held up his hand and said, "It's okay. We speak English." "Really?" exclaimed Leopold. "That's good." He wondered what a tribe of nomads in the middle of the desert would need to learn English for. He was intrigued. "You've come for the robe, haven't you?" "How did you know?" "I have my contacts. Out here in the desert. Especially out here in the desert." A blend of admiration and surprise gave Leopold pause. Best not to take these desert dwellers for granted. Leopold and his men were welcomed into the tent, refreshed with water and tea, and offered lunch, as the men were just about to eat. Leopold said he couldn't stay for long, but appreciated the invitation. Another time, perhaps, though he didn't plan on it. He sat down on the mat where some of the men had already started eating. Turning to the man who spoke such good English, opened the briefcase and watched as the group eyed its contents with poker faces. "There's $500,000 in there." Silence was the reply. The group speaker, who seemed also to be the group's leader, sat in deep contemplation, as if remembering something important that all things must pause for. After an awkward minute or so of this, he finally signaled to one of his men to go and fetch the robe. Leopold's heart started beating. This was what he came for. This is what he liked. No hassle, no aggro, just people doing business. A woman in a hijab, who seemed to be the speaker's wife, walked over, holding a royal blue bag made of what looked like cashmere. The speaker, whose name Leopold knew not, seemed emotional, as if he was parting with an old friend, as he carefully, gently pulled out a golden robe from the blue bag. It was such a sight to behold. The flowing robe sparkled like a golden river in the Bedouin's hands. It seemed to have its own aura, an incredible presence, captivating its audience. "Take it." The speaker's profound silence was finally broken by his decision to let go of the robe, pass it on to the next one in line. Leopold accepted the robe like it was a newborn baby, holding it with delicate restraint, inspired by a sense of reverent awe, which seemed to make speech meaningless. The intensity of emotion in that moment, between these two men, between past and future, seemed to suck the oxygen from the tent, making it even more of a challenge to breathe the thick desert air. Leopold's security detail seemed shaky, like they intuited that now was a good time to leave. The interpreter made this clear, saying, "Are we ready to go now, sir?" The moment was over, gone, only to flow into countless other wordless, airless moments, now that he had the golden robe. Leopold folded the robe and put it back into the cashmere bag. He stood up, thanking the tribe for their hospitality. This small talk was interrupted by the speaker, who shut the briefcase and handed it back to Leopold. "You can take your money too. We don't need it." Leopold chuckled. "Who doesn't need $500,000? "We don't," shot back the speaker, pushing the case into the hands of Leopold, who took offense at the gesture. "You could use it to buy some more camels or something." He just couldn't help himself. He had behaved so well so far, but inevitably the real Leopold would always reveal itself. "I know camels aren't cheap." The speaker once again seemed troubled, going silent for a few breaths, before saying with some deep feeling in his voice, "The ignorance of Westerners never ceases to amaze me. Why would you assume us poor? Because we live on little? compared to you, who wastes and uses more than he needs? We want not for money, Leopold. Our treasures are those of the soul. Leopold shrank back. He didn't remember giving this man his name. Okay, fine. I just don't understand, that's all. Understand what? If you have money, wealth, why do you do this? I mean, why don't you... Leopold was once again interrupted by the speaker, who said, buy a mansion? A private jet? My own island? An apartment in Dubai, maybe? Some of my friends have these things. I have no care for them. I've lived in the world, known many men like you before. Too many. That is why I like to be out here, to be far away from them. Leopold felt agitated by this man's abrupt, sullen demeanour. The speaker's cold stare burned into him, and he temporarily forgot all about the golden robe he came for, caught up in a strange battle of wills with this man from the desert who spoke English so beautifully. I will not lie, Leopold. It is difficult for me to part with the robe, but it is my custom, the law of my culture, and in keeping with the legend of the robe, that I cannot refuse you, and that I can accept no payment for it. Leopold raised his left eyebrow. Well, each to their own. The speaker smiled. There are rules to the use of the robe. Have you not learned them yet? Don't worry. You will learn them soon enough. I think we better go now, sir, the agent/interpreter said more firmly now, doing his part to break up the fight so they could all get going. Yes, you're right. Let's go, Leopold replied. Thank you, he said to the speaker, without any real emotion, still irate from the speaker's words, as he and his agents walked from the tent, the golden robe under his arm. The four men boarded the helicopter and flew away from this mysterious palace in the desert. The Golden Robe, Part 4, The Empire of Dust. Leopold struggled to free himself from the rubble around him. Amazingly, he didn't seem to be hurt. Just as he managed to push the large block of concrete off his body, there was another loud, earth-shattering blast, followed by more concrete falling on top of him. He repeated the same freeing himself procedure again, only for the same thing to keep happening, with him becoming trapped, then free, trapped, and so on. Still not a scar, nor a bruise or cut on him. Where was all this concrete falling from? There was only one ceiling. He freed himself from the latest ceiling beam to fall across his legs, and crawled in darkness over the trashed apartment block, hearing the cries and screams of other people suffering nearby. Another blast, and he was once again encased in rock, this time so securely that he could hardly move. The haunting cries got louder and more piercing, sending shockwaves through his already traumatized flesh. Then, one by one, bodies arose from the floor, the dead coming back to life, moving awkwardly, covered in blood, some headless or with missing body parts. The zombified entities staggered towards him. Then he heard his name come from the lips of one of them, then another and another, until slowly a whole mob of half-dead beings were in front of him, each one repeating his name in vengeful tones. Leopold! He was so firmly locked into the concrete slabs around him that he couldn't move at all. He began screaming as the zombies surrounded him on all sides, certain that their intentions for him were not pleasant. Then the first pair of hands pressed around his neck, followed by another pair of hands, as the mob tried to choke the life out of him. Gasping for air, he managed to free his right arm and flung it out in front of him. "No!" he cried out. Leopold looked around his large, modern Art Deco bedroom, still trying desperately to catch his breath. It took him a few minutes to realize it had only been a bad dream, a very bad one. The same nightmare, in fact, he'd been having every night for weeks. They were always so real. Realer than real, in many ways. As these days, Leopold's emotional life had collapsed in on itself. He felt numb most of the time. The things that used to give him at least a little relief, barely even triggering a response now. Scratching his balding head while looking at his 40-something-year-old body in the bathroom mirror, though still fairly trim, the pot belly that protruded, hanging over his boxers, and his wrinkled, bloodshot eyes spoke of the excesses of his decadent lifestyle. What was the meaning of this dream? What was his subconscious trying to tell him? He needed to speak to somebody, anybody, but there was no one left. It had been months since he'd spoken to anyone but his security detail, with most people around him finally showing their true colors and abandoning him to his fate. All he had left was the Golden Robe. It had lived up to its promise and given him everything he had asked for, but he still wasn't happy. Far from it. Leopold was in a more wretched state now than ever. Never before recognizing the value of having people around who could give him checks and balances, he could not remember the last time he washed or had a shave. No one could bear his negative attitude and unreasonable stubbornness any longer. He felt completely alone. He called Mike on the intercom, who came through the door with fresh coffee. Mike, his prized security agent/interpreter, asked how Leopold was. "Not doing too good, Mike," answered Leopold. "I just can't seem to get it together lately." Mike opened his mouth to say something, then seemed to think better of it and stepped back. "Out with it," barked Leopold. "It's not my place, sir," said Mike, trying to change the subject. "Do you need more sugar?" "Mike," Leopold blurted out accusingly, then said in a pleading tone, almost begging, "You're the only one who's left. The only man I've ever really been able to trust. The only thing that resembles reality in my world is you, Mike. The women who charge $1,000 an hour to pretend they like me, the judges with their hands out, the politicians waiting for my instructions, the fake friends slithering around who want to inherit some of this empire of dust before it finally washes out with the tide. Everyone has an agenda, Mike. Some selfish, ulterior motive. None of it's real. None of it's honest. Only you, Mike. Only you are truth. Tell me like it is, Mike. Please." "Why don't you take a break, sir?" "A break, Mike? From all this?" "What do you mean take a break, Mike? I can take breaks whenever I like. I don't have to report to anyone." "What I mean, sir, is—" Mike hesitated, stepping cautiously with his temperamental employer. "Why don't you take a step back from it all? For a few weeks or months even. You don't owe anyone anything. Why not take some time for yourself to get the help that you need?" Mike didn't need to spell it out. Leopold knew he was referring to the Grove or some such plush psychiatric facility for the filthy rich. "Maybe you're right, Mike. Maybe you're right." Leopold trailed off as he hung his head over his coffee cup, seemingly lost in the swirling, spiraling motion of the cream as he poured it in slowly. "Yes, I will have some more sugar, Mike. Thanks." Leopold took a gulp of the fresh hot coffee and smiled as the rich brew warmed his insides, giving thanks and praise to the gods of coffee for this strong caffeinated boost to his low mood. "Kenyan, I love this stuff. Niggers make the best coffee." Looking up at Mike, he said apologetically, "Sorry, Mike. Sometimes I forget that you're black. I didn't mean any offense." Mike seemed unperturbed. "None taken, sir." Leopold always suspected there was something terribly wrong with him, but figured being born into wealth made it okay. Only the plebs had to worry about things like mental health. Something about what Mike said resonated with him, though, and it didn't take long to convince himself to give the Grove a try. After 3 months at the Grove, Leopold still hadn't revealed much about his inner world to anyone, preferring to keep his thoughts his own, locked up inside himself. He was surprised at the people he came across in there. CEOs, managing directors of international firms, army generals, bankers, plenty of the people he'd been in cahoots with in his wonder years. Some opened up about their crimes, feeling a conscious easing catharsis in the sharing. Tales of creative illegal money laundering, embezzling billions of dollars, crashing economies for a better stock portfolio, imaginative population control strategies, all spoken freely in this safe space for the haunted handlers of planet Earth. Others, like Leopold, preferred to just take it all in, and to heal themselves vicariously through the extroversion of these tortured rich men's selfish testimonials. Who would believe him anyway, that it was him who was the key component in starting World War III? If he'd had the gall to open up in group therapy about his meetings with the Russian premier, the plans to make a literal killing in oil profits from both sides of the conflict, the other patients would likely just believe such statements to be a part of his mental illness, grandiosity, and an overinflated sense of importance, delusions of grandeur, too many nights on the source. He wasn't a show-off like these puffed-up men around him in this circle. He'd never embarked on such projects for the glory, quite the opposite. The whole thing was really about how much you could get away with without a soul knowing, a need-to-know basis, where only a very few needed to know. "Leopold, would you like to share?" The words of the pretty-faced volunteer woke him from his inner dialogue. This week's discussion was about emotional intelligence. The group had been sharing examples from their lives of when they'd acted with it or wished they'd had more of it to act with. Act was the operative word, with concepts like empathy being totally alien to psychopaths like Leopold, who would periodically study such ideas and then put on his best performance of empathy to appear as human as possible. Certainly, the ex-wives of some of these troubled men had plenty of emotional intelligence and had taken their husbands to the cleaners with it. If men like this could manage to distill this empathic quality down to its raw essence, its active ingredient, and harness it for use in their projects for world domination, just imagine how much more control they could have over people. The guise of empathy would enable them to eviscerate the earth even more effectively than they had already done, while receiving awards and accreditation for their efforts. The hypocrisy of Nobel Peace Prizes for the most humane torture methods. "No thanks. I don't feel like sharing today," replied Leopold sheepishly. Not that he ever felt like sharing his thoughts with any of these people. Still, the sparkle in the eye of the volunteer held out hope that one day he would. "Well, maybe next time then," she said with a smile. They had repeated this ritual every week for the past 3 months. She moved on to the next person in the circle, who, unlike Leopold, was happy to take center stage and rant on at length about everything he claimed to know on the subject. Leopold was intrigued by this woman. She had been here every week without fail since he'd arrived at the Grove. She wasn't like the other volunteers who seemed to just turn up to get their timesheet stamped. While they seemed bored and did little, she really got involved in the sessions, getting the men to talk about things they'd kept bottled up for decades. Maybe it just needed a woman's touch. Her smile was definitely disarming. Leopold was becoming quite besotted with this young woman. She wasn't even being paid, yet she showed more heartfelt enthusiasm than most of these professionals with several letters after their names, who were making a small fortune working here at the Grove. The session came to an end, and Leopold thought he'd have a word with this volunteer before she left. As the men filtered out of the room, he stayed seated, holding his head as if in pain. Once she noticed him, she came over and asked, "Leopold, are you okay?" He looked up with an innocent puppy dog expression to elicit the sympathy of the attractive woman. "Not really." "What's wrong?" she asked. Leopold delayed his response for dramatic effect and to draw more of her positive attention towards him. It's just that, well, I have so much to say, but I'm just not used to talking to anyone about it. The volunteer sat down beside him and considered his words before saying, "Yes, you are quite the enigma. In fact, I think this is the most I've ever heard you speak." The other volunteers had already left, no doubt glad to be free from this place. She seemed, though, to have all the time in the world for Leopold. "I've got a little time before I leave, if you want to talk," she invited. Leopold looked up at this gorgeous woman in her early 30s. Slim build, cheerful demeanor. She was like a walking breath of fresh air. Dark-skinned, heart-shaped face, with big, childlike, caring eyes. She had her hair in a plaited style he wasn't familiar with. "You are remarkable, do you know that?" he commented after taking her in. The volunteer replied humbly, "I'm just a volunteer," though her grin showed that she appreciated the compliment. "But why?" asked Leopold. "Why what? Why would you come here every week and give of your time, your energy, for us, of all people, and for no payment?" "Well, there are some things worth more than money, Leopold." "Really? Such as?" "The experience, the knowledge. It's priceless. I'm learning so much more in these group therapy sessions than I do the rest of the week in class. This is more, well, hands-on." "So you're interested in a career in mental health?" "Yes. I've always been a protector of sorts, looking after my sisters when my mum wasn't well, and then eventually I had to look after her as well. It's in me to want to help people. I was working as a mentor in corporate in London before this, but it wasn't really fulfilling me." "London?" exclaimed Leopold. "That's quite a journey you're having to make." "Oh no, I stay in Oxford. The rest of the week I'm cooped up in stuffy study rooms, so I really enjoy a break from that, being here once a week." Oxford University? Leopold had read something about Oxford and Cambridge making places available for students of African descent. Something about not enough of them going to the top universities and the need for more diversity. "Oh no, not the university, it's a college. They teach health and social care courses. I was able to get a bursary, so that really helps with my rent and my outgoings." "Amazing," said Leopold, who was having the most fun he had experienced in months connecting with this lovely woman. His standard female fare was of the hit-and-run variety. Most of the women he knew were just as manipulative and lacking in moral scruples as he was, if not more so. The women in his family would never dream of making such sacrifices for others, happy to be seen publicly giving a tiny fraction of their immense wealth to charity, but not so keen on doing any of the actual charity work itself. "And now, Leopold, I have a question for you. Why the Grove? Why travel all the way to England? Don't they have any places like this in America?" Leopold replied, smiling flirtatiously, "Ah, yes, they do. But you see, I have my finer tastes. Only the best will do for me." She seemed to warm to his words. He continued, "You're a special soul. I don't imagine just anyone can do what you do. And you have a real skill for it. The way you get us blockheads to look at ourselves. In such a world of terrible self-centeredness, what a diamond you are in your selflessness." "Oh, you're making me blush now." She was visibly moved by his praise. "I still like the good things in life, though. I have my finer tastes too. That's why I'm volunteering here, at the Grove, and not at the Maudsley." The Maudsley? Leopold was unfamiliar with the name. "It's a psychiatric hospital in South London, not far from where I live. Would have made more sense for me to volunteer there, but I didn't want to. The clientele at the Maudsley could never afford to come here." "Ah, I see. A mental hospital for the plebs," thought Leopold. He had never felt so alive in years. Speaking with this woman was for him like the first conversation he'd ever really had with a woman. "So why did you finally decide to leave your last job then?" The volunteer wasn't usually so keen to give this much information away about herself in this setting where she, not Leopold, was meant to be the therapist. But she was excited at seeing this usually inwardly caged, silent man so chatty and expressive. She wanted to encourage it. Well, I was mentoring a young man who just started at an insurance firm when one day he just disappeared, never to be seen again. At the time, I took it as a sign to get out while I still could. Disappeared? Quizzed Leopold. Oh, it was all a very strange affair. There was a shop that disappeared too. One day it was there, next day it was gone. All very weird. People and shops don't just disappear. Leopold paused as if something sharp had pierced him inside. He leaked out an involuntary moan. The Golden Robe. The change in tone of voice and the sudden emotional weight that sank into these words caught the volunteer off guard. For a few seconds, it was like she was standing in front of a vacant shell with nobody home. Leopold, are you okay? She spoke into the void. Slowly his vision came back from a blur into focus, and he returned from wherever he had gone. He read her name from the label pinned to her blouse. Though she'd been coming to the group for months, he never knew what her name was or thought to ask. I'm okay, thanks, Laura. I'm glad you're back. I'm not sure where you went there, said Laura. I'm going to have to get going now, but maybe we can continue this conversation next week after the group. You seem to open up more in a one-to-one setting. I don't mind staying an extra 20 minutes or so. Really? You'd do that for me? It's what I'm here for, Leopold. They were both glad that they would be meeting weekly and privately from now on, both curious to find out what the other knew about the Golden Robe. Small world, thought Leopold. Thank you, Laura. I can't wait. The Golden Robe. Written and read by Julian Brown. The Golden Robe, Part 5, Heaven or Hell. From as far back as Sedgwick could remember, he'd been accused by many of being a helpless daydreamer, ever since the days when his mother would ask him to quickly run to the shop to buy some milk, and he'd return many hours later with fanciful tales that no one believed, involving glowing shapes moving amongst the bushes and strange little dancing people singing and reading poetry to him. He seemed to be a lad caught between two worlds, this one and a far more interesting one elsewhere. The same thing would happen at school, with Sedgwick often being humiliated in front of the whole class, unable to prove he was paying attention. Of course, it wasn't long after the detentions, scoldings, groundings, and various punishments failed to correct his wayward behavior that he was put on a daily regimen of powerful psychotropic medications, everything from olanzapine to risperidone, Ritalin to Prozac. The combined effect of this chemical cocktail over time seemed only to push Sedgwick even further away from those trying to reach him and deeper into the alternate void he inhabited. His life had been a catalogue of missed opportunities, never really being present enough to cut the grade. Most people were fast to label and diagnose him for all his perceived flaws, but very few spent any real time trying to understand him. Not much had changed for Sedgwick now as an adult. He continued to be here, and yet somewhere else. He continued to do as he thought he should be doing as dictated by the world around him. He didn't enjoy much of it, but at least it kept his mother and the rest of the family off his back. The fact that he had acquired a normal job and was at long last living a normal life was enough to ease the conscience of those who felt somewhat responsible for him, even if he wasn't particularly happy. In his mother's eyes, this was a good thing. It wasn't normal to be particularly happy in this day and age. What with killer viruses escaping from biolabs, cost of living crisis, and World War III kicking off in Eastern Europe, better to live a meaningful life than a happy one. Sedgwick felt his life was neither meaningful nor happy, though, and so when he stumbled upon the Golden Robe and had the good sense to try it on and make a wish, and was instantly whisked away to this dimension of magic and wonder, he found he had achieved both in one deft stroke. Where was he? He wasn't sure. It was a village by the coast, very much like where he'd grown up, but nicer. People here treated him with respect and kindness, and had no desire to judge or condemn him. In fact, people here only had time for real things like love and fun, smiles, and being helpful. No one tried to fix Sedgwick. They appreciated him just as he was. He made some new friends here who helped him to build his house by the beach. Sedgwick felt like he was starting all over again, beginning anew. It was as if all his past sins had been washed away. It was a victorious journey of rediscovery, building his new house with his new entourage and then decorating the place and making it home. He enjoyed every part of it, from putting up scaffolding to sanding down walls and laying down the carpet and laminate flooring, each step like a masterstroke of the brush on the canvas, painting the picture of his new life. One moment of fulfillment seemed only to flow into another, when soon after his home was completed, he met the love of his life, Nancy. She was a beauty inside and out, like he had never known before. She loved Sedgwick, and he loved her. Together, they raised a large family in that lovely house by the beach and lived an idyllic life only read about in books. Sedgwick would rise early and sit on the balcony wondering where his old life went, looking out over the sea, seeing enormous winged beings of light dancing above the waves, hundreds of them, moving in unison like starlings, with no clear leader, and yet all being led towards some higher, greater truth in a harmony of all. Some other people here saw the same visions. Even those who weren't able to see the little dancing people or the glowing shapes did not chastise Sedgwick for his perception. No, on the contrary, he was seen as a unique soul and treated as very special because of his gift of sight. He did not have an answer to the many questions he had. Was this the same Earth, or was this another reality, a parallel universe? Was there another Sedgwick in that old life that he'd left behind, still depressed, still floating aimlessly through life from one job to another? Was he merely one version of Sedgwick copied and pasted here? Or was there only one Sedgwick, ripped from that time and space and reconstituted here in this coastal utopia? Though he could not explain the anomaly, he felt no anxiety. For scientists with all their intellect still could not explain the great mysteries of existence, from everything from the growth of an acorn into a great oak, to the orbits of moons around planets and planets around suns. They could give you a lot of numbers and formulas, but couldn't answer the most basic question. Why? Meanwhile, Leopold found himself in great distress, held down on the ground and helpless. This would normally be the stuff of his wildest dreams, as he would usually be in the power position, in control of the fantasy. Here, he was taken against his will by rotting corpses, some female, some male, bleeding all over him as they satisfied their lustful urges. Every time his body was manipulated to perform, he would see a flash image in his mind of his attacker's past, prior to this invasion of his intimate parts. He saw women and men gang raped by soldiers among the abandoned ruins of bombed apartment blocks. Husbands shot or beaten to death in front of their wives. Inevitably, the traumatized woman who witnessed this would offer much less resistance, if any at all, to the unwanted advances of these uniformed devils. It was as if humankind, even in what seemed like a sophistication of culture and advancement, was only ever a few breaths away from utter savagery. The primal, predatory animal instinct lurking just under the thin veil of civility. Drop a few bombs, and it had the effect of blowing this door clean off its hinges to release all the dormant, repressed demons hidden in everyday folk. These were the inevitable perversions that came with war. In this chaos, many good people became corrupt. Unless a person practiced a true dedication to higher principles of living, the moral compass went haywire and could no longer point true north. Leopold could not feel remorse. It was not the way he was built, and so for the sake of balance to which the universe is ultimately committed, it had to find another way to make him aware of the extremity of what he had done. He knew that every corpse that took advantage of him was previously someone who had themselves been ravaged by the evils of the war he started. These recurring dreams were breaking him. He had never felt so dysfunctional. Something meant to be propping him up from the inside of himself had completely collapsed, like the infrastructure of a war-torn nation. The dreams had become life. His consciousness consisted of nothing else. His waking life had no taste, no color. Intensity came back as soon as he shut his eyes and saw and felt for himself the pain and agony, the suffering he had caused to millions of people. How could one man alone bear such torment? It was too much to endure. Most of Leopold's waking day was now spent heavily tranquilized into an almost comatose state. Ketamine was the only thing that seemed to settle him and switch his mind off so that he could at least have some time away from the haunting, vengeful mob in his mind. Just as it was necessary to breathe and to eat, it was necessary to sleep and unavoidable. Leopold could resist, but at some point he would have to close his eyes. And once again, all that persecuted him would return to him vividly from inside his own heart. One night, as he was staring up at the ceiling, fighting the pull of sleep, he saw in his mind's eye a vision of Laura, the pretty-faced volunteer. She was smoking a cigarette on a distant stretch of the lawn with a secretive air about her, as if she was hiding. Laura seemed to be in deep thought. It had been ages since he'd last seen her, since he'd last gone to weekly group therapy sessions. Ever since meeting Laura, Leopold had regressed into such a debilitated, awful state with his persistent manic tantrums that Dr. Mallowan, the authority at the Grove, decided to isolate him from the main population of the hospital for the safety of staff and the other patients. In all of this commotion, he had forgotten about Laura, and remembering her now, wanted so much to see her and speak with her again. Just then, the whole building shook violently. An incredibly piercing sound popped Leopold's ears, reducing everything to silence around him. Then he found himself on the lawn of the Grove, which was no longer the lush green of grass and hedges, but marshes of mud and broken pavement slabs swimming in pools of blood. He looked up and saw the mob returning, coming for him from every direction, all calling out his name. There was nowhere to run to or hide, the bombed-out main building behind him now in ruins. Leopold grabbed fistfuls of mud, earth, cement, anything he could get his hands on, throwing it at the approaching half-dead army. Then he heard the clanging of a bell, the discordant frequency of the sound vibrating through his body and making him panic even more. At that moment, Dr. Mallowan entered Leopold's room and witnessed him hyperventilating, screaming in terror and throwing his own feces at the walls around him. How long had he been doing this? The inside of his room looked like that of an Irishman on a hunger strike at the infamous H Block during the Troubles. Dr. Mallowan shook his head in disbelief. It was worse for Leopold than he first thought. He instructed 7 fairly well-built men in nursing attire to restrain Leopold. After some effort, they were able to overpower and sedate him with a needle in his back, bringing an end to his latest manic episode. Laura sat on a bench at the end of the lawns of the Grove, sneaking a cigarette before the group started. She thought of Leopold and the Golden Robe. She'd asked a friend who was interested in the occult if he knew anything about it. Surprisingly, he was more than just a "please subscribe to my channel" YouTuber, and had actually done some research, and so was able to give her some of his insights on the matter. She wanted to question Leopold specifically about the Golden Robe, but he had been far out of her reach for some time now. When Dr. Malowan told her that Leopold's condition had worsened so much they had to separate and sedate him and put him in a kind of solitary confinement, she felt annoyed at herself for honestly caring little for his welfare, only so far as it could furnish her with the information she needed. Did Leopold know what happened to Sedgwick? Where was Sedgwick? Where was the Golden Robe? Laura would demand that Dr. Malowan allow her to see Leopold today, even if just for a few minutes. It would be good for him to see a friendly face, she would say. It might even help his recovery. She would put her foot down with the doctor, for he was known to be stubborn. Laura had been coming to the Grove now for half a year consistently every week to volunteer in the sessions, so she felt she had earned the right to be heard. The Golden Robe, Part 6. Dictators come in every colour. The subject matter for this week's session was New Beginnings. There was an ominous tone to this title, with the sound of Chinooks and F-35 jets flying by overhead. In recent days, England had entered Serious Threat Level 4. This wasn't as serious as Level 5, where food rationing and curfews would be imposed, but was a worrying step away from the relative comfort of Level 3. At Serious Threat Level 6, a state of emergency would be officially declared, giving the military jurisdiction to take over the role of policing. All over social media, on TV and radio, were breaking news reports of Russian warships sighted off the west coast of Ireland. This, not long after the Russian Premier's veiled threat, bragging of possessing the military might to sink the United Kingdom and leave it beneath the waves like the fabled lost city of Atlantis. While from the east, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the conflict made their perilous journey towards Britain's shores. The backlash from locals was intense and often violent. Protests against the mass influx of asylum seekers descended into riots outside centres where claims were being processed. Ironically, the parents and grandparents of many of the most vocal of these protesters faced a similarly hostile reception when they first arrived in England. Once again, Leopold was not in attendance, but as is often the case when two energies seek out each other with equal intensity, the ether conspires with itself to allow this meeting to take place. And so when the group broke for a 15-minute break, Laura sought out her secret smoking spot under the guise of needing the ladies' room. When she got there was a hooded figure sitting on the bench where she usually sat. With some irritation, she looked around to find another spot nearby where she could smoke alone. Laura! She heard her name come from the bench. The hooded figure turned to face her, pulling his hood back to reveal his face. Leopold! Sit down, please. They allow me out on the lawn for a few minutes every day. They are not far. They'll come to get me soon. They? The nurses. Well, if you can call them that. Mercenaries more like. How are you, Leopold? Oh, not so bad. Could be worse. It can always be worse. How are you? It's really good to see you again. I'm fine, thanks. I was just sneaking a quick cigarette. I didn't know you smoked. Nasty habit, you know. Yes, well, that's why I come down here so no one sees me. So it's okay as long as no one sees you. No, I mean, Laura, it's fine. We all have our vices, our secrets. Laura frowned. How did you know to find me here? Oh, not much passes my attention, Leopold said playfully, before taking a more serious tone. He continued. Having wealth can be a double-edged sword. People assume because you have money, you're happy. Because of this assumption, the rich often endure terrible poverty. One good thing about having money, though, is that when you can't see, you can pay others to see for you. Just then a bird flew by speedily in front of them, squawking loudly, as if to confirm the truth of Leopold's words. They followed the bird's flight path with their gaze, and their eyes fell upon a squirrel nibbling on an acorn, sitting upright on a low tree branch. It seemed to be staring directly at them both. Laura wondered how long it had been there. "Dr. Mallowan said you haven't been well. I was told you were in a comatose state." "Ah, yes, but I didn't swallow today." Leopold opened his fist to reveal 2 tablets in his palm. Realizing time was ticking away, Laura sparked up her cigarette and offered the pack to Leopold. "Oh, no thanks, Laura. I can be accused of many things. Smoking is not one of them, though." It went silent between them for a few breaths as Laura toked away, steeling herself for her planned speech. "Leopold, when we spoke last time, you mentioned something about the Golden Robe." On hearing mention of the robe, Leopold closed his eyes as if looking within himself for strength. Laura continued. "Well, I did a little research, and I found out a few things about this robe. The legend says he who wears the robe will become king." That made me think. Leopold interrupted her. "Whether it works for women too?" "Yes, these ancient myths tend to focus on the man, mankind, as a man thinks, and so on. I think that's got more to do with the prejudices of the translators than with the legends themselves. It should therefore read instead, whomever wears the robe shall rule over the whole of the earth." "So it's true then?" Laura asked. "All these terrible things happening in the world right now, the war, the air raid sirens being tested every morning. This all has something to do with you, doesn't it?" A knowing smile grew across Leopold's face. "Oh yes," he thought. "This war has everything to do with me, if only you knew the half of it. All the paths that lead back to me, my family, particularly me. We've been the main authority ensuring free energy suppression as a fundamental protocol universally, continuing the age-old legacy began by the robber barons, the oil moguls who silenced Nikola Tesla. There's always at least one like him in every generation. The persistent visionaries. Of course, we don't cut them down too early. It's good to let them blossom so we can take the entirety of their life's works and manipulate their ideas towards achieving our own agendas. Free energy. It's just not compatible with the setup we have. Of course, we can draw all the energy we need directly from the ether in the atmosphere around us. But then how would we maintain our control? Oil has been central to all the world wars as a necessity to be fought over, a commodity to ensure endless war. Where would we be without it? Look how many millions of undesirables, the lower rungs of society that we overtly cull every year with our manufactured energy crisis, knowing fully well that not even one of those many millions of people had to die. Still, they continue, the visionaries, with their humanitarian ideas, their technology to produce clean drinking water from the air, their free electricity devices, all genius and no smarts. How could these people realistically think they'd have a chance to bring these visions into being in any meaningful way? Are they not able to discern the kind of world that we live in? Oh, Laura, as much as I enjoy being so mysterious, you don't know how much I'd like to share all of this with you. But something tells me that you're not ready. Or maybe I'm not ready. Maybe I should lead you off the scent. Maybe I just like playing with you." Leopold eyed Laura staring back at him patiently, expectantly, and said, "You are quite impressive, aren't you? Despite your obvious affliction." "My affliction?" Laura shot back curiously. Leopold's eyes seemed to glaze over as he smiled. "Your skin. Your type always go on about how afflicted you are, how someone else apart from you is responsible for your life." Laura sensed where the conversation was going. "I don't consider my skin an affliction. I love my skin. I'm proud of my black culture and heritage." "Ha! What is black culture without some other race to blame? All your political movements have been based on how afflicted, how oppressed you are. The Black Panthers, Black Lives Matter. It's never what you stand for, is it? Always what you stand against. The police, white supremacy, the system. but I've never been able to work out what you actually stand for." "They are standing for justice, Leopold." "Justice? I guess when there's no justice, there's just us," Leopold said mockingly. "Exactly," shot back Laura, "and I bet you have no idea what it feels like being in that position. It's not a level playing field. Not everyone can afford fancy lawyers and top-level care at the Grove." "Well, your people love a heated argument and a fight, that's for sure," said Leopold dismissively. "I'm proud of my people, building literally from the ashes and achieving great things, from nothing but a vision and sheer determination," said Laura, refusing to take Leopold's bait to become enraged. "It's just not as simple as you put it, Leopold. There are many more layers to it. You've conveniently left out 400 years of forced enslavement from your analysis." "Ah, yes, 400 years. Your people's answer to everything. I can't hold down a job. Can't keep my family together. I can't stay off the drugs. Well, let's just blame the white man and his slavery so we can still have some contrived modicum of dignity about ourselves." Laura was beginning to feel very annoyed, not banking on having this conversation, yet not surprised either, as race was always a topic lingering around, waiting to be unearthed. "Well, I certainly don't blame anyone for my failures but me. You can't paint a whole race of people with that brush. Black people are not a monolith. What about the black conservatives who reject all that you say, who stand for personal responsibility, rebuilding the black family, the core values of integrity? Words, just words, a political necessity to distance themselves from the riffraff. I'm sorry, Laura. Maybe it's just my ignorance. I haven't had much actual interaction with your type. Apart from a few African dictators with a complex set of offshore accounts and semi-legal tax avoidance strategies. You know the ones you read about in the news, who watch their people starve while they hide in their golden palaces. I've met quite a few of these in my lifetime. They are a sad representation of your so-called achievements. Dictators come in every color, Leopold. We are in the middle of a world war started by a white Russian dictator as we speak. Let's put things into perspective. Leopold gave no response. Seeing her cigarette burning closer down to the tip, she decided to skip this irritating small talk and went straight in. "You have the Golden Robe, don't you, Leopold?" Laura continued, hoping he would answer soon. "I think you have the robe, and you're not sure what to do with it now. I think you're meant to give it to me." "And what would you do with it?" Leopold finally spoke. Laura took a deep pull on the shrinking white stick. "It's no secret that the Golden Robe is about power and control." "Ah, but what kind of power? What kind of control?" said Leopold, more to himself than to Laura. "It would be noble to say power over yourself, control over your emotions, your actions," answered Laura. "And while that's all very lovely and new age, we all know who really has the power in this world. People like you. People who don't have to wait in line, who don't have to ask anyone's permission for anything." "Dr. Mallowan might not be so quick to agree with you there," joked Leopold. "So this is what you want," he said, now in a more morose tone. "Power and control, not to make things right." "With power and control, I could make everything right," Laura said in the affirmative. "But I'd need to make myself strong first. That's how you guys think, isn't it? Make sure your families, your children, your children's children will be secure and have all their needs taken care of. Why not? My family could run things just as well as any of you lot." Hoping to appeal to Leopold's lower nature, Laura pressed on with her words. "I wouldn't want so many wars, of course, but I wouldn't completely end them either. I'm not naive. I know how profitable war is for the economy and the wealthiest families." Laura was met with a loud silence. Leopold sat completely still and seemed once again to have gone missing from his body. The vacant shell of Leopold sat next to Laura, unmoving, unresponsive. "Leopold, are you there?" Then, just as he spat out the words "the Golden Robe" at the end of their last conversation, today he ended their chat with a similarly cryptic message. "I must return to the desert." Leopold suddenly jumped up from the bench and without another word marched away from Laura. He was met by the nurses at the end of the path, who escorted him back to his room. Well, there was always next week, thought Laura, as she stamped out her cigarette in anger and began walking back to the main building. However, when Laura returned the following week and asked for Leopold, nobody at the Grove seemed to know who she was talking about. The nurses scratched their heads as if it was the first time they'd ever heard the name. Dr. Mallowan said that there was no one by that name being treated at the Grove. "But remember, you said he'd been having terrible nightmares and manic episodes. You had to put him in solitary," she cried. Dr. Mallowan, with a quizzical smirk on his face, said that that was a fair description of at least 2/3 of the clientele here, adding, while laughing, that even some of the doctors and nurses fell into that category from time to time. Laura wondered now if Leopold ever existed. Ever since she had seen the Golden Robe in that mystical gift shop, life had been very strange for her in many ways. Maybe she needed to see a therapist herself. Had this all been just a very real daydream? Still, there was something in Dr. Mallowan's eyes, a knowing smile, which suggested to her that he was lying. As she made her way to the exit, a man was mopping the floor in blue overalls. He had just started, and Laura made the considerate gesture of trying to walk around and not over the wet floor. He turned towards her and met her gaze. "Leopold," she said in recognition, but the man corrected her, pointing to his name badge which read Stanley, and then smiled at her reassuringly. It wasn't him. The man's tattooed arms and muscular frame being the most obvious difference, and yet his face could easily be a double for Leopold's own. Laura smiled back. "Sorry, my mistake," and walked out of the building, now more confused than ever. The Golden Robe, written and read by Julian Brown. The Golden Robe, Part 7, The Return to the Desert. Mike did his best to dissuade Leopold from making the trip out into the Arabian desert, suggesting he postpone it because of an armed uprising taking place in Dammam that was being violently crushed by the Saudi military. It really made no sense to fly today, risking life and limb, but Leopold, as stubborn as ever, insisted that the trip could not wait. He felt a compelling need to return the Golden Robe to the Bedouin tribe he had got it from, immediately, imagining this was the only way to stop the madness that was engulfing the entire world, which was being savaged by the horror of war. Leopold watched the carnage below, safely, on plasma screens inside the air-conditioned helicopter, as they took off from the helipad once again. Never before could he actually feel the pain of the people he saw suffering like he did now. The screen had always acted as a barrier between him and reality, a filter, turning the loss and trauma of people into mere entertainment. Leopold, though, was changing, and a painful empathy and sense of guilt weighed him down now wherever he went. He saw a mob of protesters there 1 minute, then gone the next, after being carpet bombed, and felt as if he could hear the cries of their wives and mothers echoing through him. He felt their grief as if it were his own. The zoom lens feature of the chopper's cameras enabled Leopold to see in close up the damage that had been done. A man that previously held a placard up to the sky was now laying on the ground screaming, having been separated from his legs. Leopold's heart sank into his stomach. He felt the man's agony and saw an image of the man's future, full of hardship, and only if he was able to survive this bombing campaign first. He felt Mike's eyes pierce into the side of his head as this rolling footage played out live in front of them both. He knew Mike was saying this was the reason they should leave the trip for another day, but on the contrary, This was the very reason they had to go today. Nonetheless, it was too much for him right now. Leopold switched off the monitor. The screen went black. He decided instead to read over some information he had been sent by one of his spiritual advisors. Leopold wanted to know more about the origins of the Golden Robe story, and was shocked to find its earliest documented incarnation in the Sudan, Egypt region of northern Africa. Several artists' renderings had been attached to the file of various tribes of dark-skinned African peoples who had been the first to ever speak of the robe in their folklore. It had apparently once been involved in the royal elite ceremonies of ancient Egypt, described here as the land of Kem, and also in some of the traditions of nearby Kushite kingdoms. He had up until now assumed the legend to be Greek or Roman, and was finding it difficult to accept this new information, which seemed to turn his whole worldview upside down. It was not hard to surmise, then, that the Golden Robe mythology entered Greece and Rome via their conquest of Egypt in its latter days. He looked at a picture of a slim black woman in a colourful head wrap, the heart shape of her face reminding him of Laura. He felt the sting of his comments about greedy African dictators and aimless black political movements he aimed at her only a couple of days ago, speaking of her people as if they were the waste product of the world. He was faced now with the truth that if it were not for these people, there would be no Golden Robe, and he would not be sitting here now flying across the desert to return it to the man who reluctantly gave it to him. An overwhelming sense of disorientation overtook Leopold. He had been getting this a lot recently, a hypersensitivity that plunged him suddenly into an unbearable feeling of insecurity. Had he made the wrong choice? Was Laura the true rightful heir to the robe? Had he been blinded by his own ignorance? No. Laura may have had good intentions, but that wasn't enough. She was young, inexperienced, lacking the wisdom needed for such a responsibility. These desert dwellers had renounced everything worldly and were therefore the best recipients. The fact that they parted with the robe without violence or payment reassured Leopold that he was in fact moving in the right direction, though in truth he wasn't sure about anything anymore. The music of the desert he had heard before as an entrancing soundtrack to his glory now haunted and stirred his soul. "We're here, sir." Leopold was freed from the captivity of the music by Mike's words, as the chopper began its landing sequence outside the black tent palace flanked by 7 camels. As before, they were met by a group of armed men with their guns lowered. The man who spoke such good English, who had spoken for the group on their previous visit, emerged from the tent last and smiling, and greeted Leopold and Mike, inviting them to enter. Leopold did not look up to meet his gaze, but acknowledged the man with a raised hand. In fact, Leopold had not made direct eye contact with anybody, even Mike, for some weeks now. Leopold wore a long, thick brown hooded cloak, with his head lowered, obscured by the hood so that you could not see his face. Whether he did this in reverence or in pity, one could not be sure. Any other man greeting Leopold would have needed some visible proof that this really was him, but this mysterious man in the desert was not like any other man. The group had grown larger since their last meeting. There seemed to be twice as many people in and around the desert tent than there had been before. Leopold searched his many thoughts, not knowing where to begin. "Please, sit." Mike accepted the coffee he was offered, seeing that others were drinking from the same pot. Leopold didn't care for tea or coffee or words, as he handed over the blue cashmere bag to the group's speaker. "Thank you. I did think you would return eventually, once you ran out of ideas." Leopold shrugged. He saw at the far end of the tent a young, attractive lady. My God, she looked so much like Laura, he thought to himself. Convinced it was Laura, he was about to jump up and run over to her when he noticed the scarification marks on her arms and neck and the difference in her height and body shape. This wasn't Laura. but could at the same time easily be her twin sister. The speaker could sense Leopold's fixation on the woman and retorted, "Really, Leopold? After everything that has transpired, all you can think about is a woman?" Leopold's attention came back to the speaker, who continued, "Haven't you had enough women, Leopold? Don't you think instead that some soul-searching would be more appropriate? You have, after all, set the world on fire. Don't you think there's more to reflect on than the shape of a young woman's body? Have you learnt nothing in all this time?" Leopold felt annoyed at the man's tone. Shouldn't he be more respectful, appreciative? After all, the robe had come back to him. He then saw with crystal clarity what eluded him before. Chains. The women were chained to one another. "I didn't figure you for human trafficking. I really thought you were better than that. What right do you have to moralize to me when you keep women as slaves?" The speaker replied calmly, "You are right about one thing. These women were slaves until we freed them." Leopold looked again at the women and could no longer see chains on their wrists as he had a moment ago. Was this some kind of desert magic? Now you see it, now you don't? Or was he really losing his mind? He hesitated, not knowing what to say or do. The corrupted project their corruption on the world around them and see only corruption, the man said defiantly, a smile gripping his face as he continued. "If you really care about the plight of such women, why not use your immense wealth to make a difference? Surely you can achieve more than some Arabs on camels in the desert." "I'm sorry, truly, I am sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean to," Leopold said, and then tried to change the subject. "All this time, I still don't know. What is your name?" "I am known by many names, but most call me Ahmed." Ahmed seemed appeased by Leopold's show of humility and continued, "The gold of the robe only reflects the gold that is within us. It can only draw out what is already inside of you. We all come from a source where we can manifest instantly whatever we desire. Here, though, on this plane of nature, that manifestation is greatly slowed down. But with the robe on, it is as if we are back home again, and so we can walk the earth like gods. It is all really a matter of faith and the will. The golden robe has no inherent power of its own. Wearing the golden robe reminds you on a cellular level of who you really are." Leopold took in Ahmed's words and said, "So does that mean that in this heavenly source place that we all come from, that I am the villain there too? Or you became the villain during your time here on earth? The worldly power you have become accustomed to since birth, without having had to earn it, made you feel like a god, but you were a god who had no training, no initiation, and no greater purpose beyond fulfilling your base desires. Such power, without guidance, distorts and corrupts even the most beautiful of souls." Seemingly touched deeply by Ahmed's words, Leopold sniffled and wiped his nose and eyes under the hood with a tissue as if he had been crying, then slowly stood up. Mike felt relieved. They could finally go. Leopold went to shake Ahmed's hand, and it turned into a hug. This man who had received so little actual love in his life, welling up now with emotion. Ahmed then led the two men out of the tent and wished him well on his journey. "Keep reaching for the light." "Oh, I don't know, Ahmed. I think it's too late for me." Ahmed chose not to reassure him that it was never too late, and said finally, after an awkward pause, "Goodbye, Leopold." "Call me Leo," replied Leopold. "Why not Leopold anymore?" Ahmed asked. "I don't like the association," replied Leopold, as he and Mike walked back to the chopper. The pilot started the engine. Leopold looked back into the tent one last time and saw the woman who looked like Laura being pushed to the ground by two men as they held her hands behind her back to tie them with rope. "They fooled us, Mike. They are traffickers," Leopold shouted before pulling the gun from Mike's holster and running back into the tent. It happened so fast and caught Mike unawares as he pulled out the small Beretta he had holstered in the other side of his blazer, but was instantly shot by a sniper stationed atop one of the nearby sand dunes. A figure arose from beneath the sand, claiming the killer shot. Inside the tent, Leopold held the gun at the two men, demanding they let the woman go. This is when he saw that they were not in fact holding her down and tying her hands with rope, but were treating a wound she had on her arm with a bandage. Once again, Leopold was terribly confused. Ahmed violently dragged Leopold out of the tent, disrespectfully, as the other men took the gun from him. The chopper's pilot had the whole time sat watching, engine kept running steadfast to stay in the craft as long as possible so as to rescue any survivors. He then saw Leopold being manhandled towards the helicopter, followed by another group of men carrying Mike's limp, lifeless body. Ahmed gestured to the pilot to open the door. He knew not what else to do, and so complied. Mike's body lay leaking blood all over the plush interior of the vehicle. Ahmed closed the door once Leopold was inside, and then walked back to the tent with his men. The chopper took off with Leopold shifting his gaze from Mike to the window and back to Mike and whispering to himself frantically, "Am I hallucinating right now? Was that some form of desert magic?" The pilot, realizing that Leopold must have lost his mind, at least for the time being, decided not to say another word and flew as fast as he could back to the helipad at Dammam. Why not Leopold anymore? Leopold now heard the same question that he had answered just a few minutes ago, and found himself standing outside the tent with Mike at his flank and Ahmed and his men in front of them. Not wanting to leave Ahmed hanging, he played his part in this strange drama and read his line out. "I don't like the association." His dreams had become so real that he couldn't be sure whether or not he had dreamed the entire episode of his attempted rescue of the slave girls. Or was it all real, and he was only dreaming now? It was a nightmare, never knowing either way. Though here and now, Mike was alive, and Leopold hadn't yet made the terrible blunder that cost his bodyguard's life. It was like he was being given another chance. Maybe he really was a god. The pilot started the engine again, or for the first time. Who knows how many times this pilot has started the engine of this helicopter in countless alternate versions of this particular episode. Leopold paused to collect himself. He still felt the horror at seeing Mike's bleeding body, and was finding it difficult to reconcile this with Mike standing next to him, unharmed and still alive. Blessed life, he thought to himself, probably for the first time ever. In the long moment that Leopold took for himself, Ahmed thought more and added, "I expect you will now forever be looking over your shoulder, anticipating that moment." "What moment?" asked Leopold. Ahmed answered, "Well, in the religion of the West, it says that the wages of sin are death." Leopold responded by raising his lowered head to reveal a tear running down his cheek beneath the brown hood that kept his face in shadow. "There are some things worse than death," he said, before pulling back the large hood to reveal his head. There was an audible wave of shock that ran through everyone as they froze, each man unable to process the grotesque image they were seeing. Some men dropped their guns, and even Mike, usually calm under any pressure, stood speechless and gently shivering. As if to grant them all some mercy, Leopold lowered his head and covered it once again with the brown hood before walking away towards the waiting helicopter. Eventually, Mike snapped out of his delirium and followed Leopold back to the chopper. Soon after this, they were on their way. The Golden Robe, Part 8. The Book of Laura. Laura had been entering these semi-sleep trance-like meditative states frequently ever since she last spoke with Leopold, whereby she would relax on her couch or bed, and soon after receive vivid visions and interesting insights. An image came to her mind of her smoking on the lawn of the Grove, though in this image she had the point of view of Dr. Mallowan, spying on her from an upstairs window. Through the doctor's eyes, she saw herself sitting on a bench, having a conversation with the empty seat next to her, as if an invisible man sat there. She thought, as Dr. Mallowan, that maybe Laura was using a hands-free set to make a phone call, and reflected, as Dr. Mallowan, that it was difficult nowadays to distinguish between this and someone having a hallucinatory chat with their imaginary friend. She pondered, as Dr. Mallowan, that all this time volunteering at the Grove, all the disturbing confessions and the group therapy sessions, were perhaps beginning to affect Laura's mental well-being. This image flowed seamlessly into another of Leopold in a hooded cloak, walking across a vast, lifeless desert. She remembered the last words she heard him say, "I must return to the desert," and allowed her ignited consciousness to take her on an inner journey of exploration. The desert, where Christ spent 40 days being tested by the devil, a torturous purification process, the dry lake of fire, a place previously full of life, now deserted. Deserter, one who escapes their previous charge, leaves behind war in search of peace. A desert with an extra S, as in what comes after the main course, and one who gets there just desserts. Laura saw Leopold as the biblical Cain, cursed to wander the earth eternally as punishment for slaying his brother Abel, as if God considered a life weighted down by this burden of murderous sin more fitting for Cain than the easy release of death. He who wears the golden robe becomes king. The question Leopold didn't ask was king of what exactly? King of your being, what you are. Leopold, the king of tragic death and pointless suffering. So that became his lot. Why hadn't she thought of it before? Laura typed desert, Leopold, golden robe into the query box at the top of the web page. There were 3 results listed from the search. One was an article from May 1933 from a British magazine called The Occult Review about an Arabian mystic named Ahmed Sir al-Khalika, who was said to be a Bedouin whose family had been in possession of the golden robe for the previous 200 years. According to the article, the robe had had several other owners during this period, who would hold onto it briefly before inevitably handing it back to Ahmed's family when they realized they were not up to the challenge. The second result from the search was a few lines of text under the heading Justice. Laura read them. A house burnt to the ground is justice for the trees cut down to make space for the house. Digestive illness is justice for the chickens, cows, sheep, pigs and fish tortured and slaughtered for our convenience. A flood is justice for the seas, rivers and streams that we pollute with our excessive waste. Human misery is justice for the way that we selfishly exploit the environment and one another. We live in a just world. The somber, cynical tone was Leopold's, but the words, concerned with justice for the environment, seemed to be at odds with his character as Laura knew him. The idea that Leopold was in fact only that, a character, in her mind, created to fulfill some inner need to make sense of everything, the war, the rising crisis-like state of everyday people, the disappearance of Sedgwick, and the general dreamlike strangeness of reality was an idea that Laura was taking more seriously now. There wasn't ever a third party who could verify both Leopold and Laura being in the same space at the same time. In many ways, Leopold was more of a caricature than a real person. Surely, reality was a lot more complicated and nuanced, and the idea of some evil rich white man sitting at a shadowy desk, pressing buttons controlling the world, was just the mind, struggling to find a simpler way to understand and process the multi-layered, interconnected, interwoven net tapestry of how the modern world actually operates. Leopold, like his name, was outdated, obsolete, a relic of the shameful past. This is a brave new world, led not by any one person or group, but by algorithms, reflecting the projections of the user. A digital democracy. Well, that's the idea. Random events make reality. What about a hidden hand at work behind all this randomness? What if this hidden hand was connected to a hidden arm, a hidden body, and so on? And what if all this hiding was done in plain sight, right in front of us in the most obvious places we never thought to look? Anything hidden can be found, thought Laura, even that which we hide from ourselves. Laura read the third result from the search, which was titled, "When the Heart Doesn't Dare." He came from far yet near, a place of death and fear. Pursued he has been by the lady of hue, sweet Lorraine, fair and true. For all this time she never knew where he went, though she had a clue. Just as Cinderella left behind her shoe, the stellar flight of Sedgwick left the shine of gold in view, charged with his care and caring too, while adorned in gold, away he flew, to a plain so close you can smell its air. With the eyes of spirit, you can tell it's there. When the heart doesn't dare ever speak its truth, it grows cold, with warmth still leaking through, though from his heart spilled forth, from its well it beamed, and so his thought took form, and beheld its dream. From the base metals of fear, cries and grief, gold in his soul was realized and released. Fear not though, Lorraine, that you shall not sail, for the stars have confirmed that you cannot fail. Laura read over the poem again. She copied and pasted it from the website into a Word document and printed it out just to make sure it was real. What a coincidence that she would find this poem here on a chat page of this Occult Mysteries website, and that it spoke of someone named Sedgwick who went missing. Lorraine, so close to her own name, obviously referring to her, the Lady of Hue, in pursuit of the truth. This peculiar discovery was the latest in a long line of interesting finds. Laura felt that she was getting nearer to the truth of the Golden Robe. It was as if some unseen force was guiding and willing her along to some kind of victory. She had become entirely consumed by the task, and now that it was the summer holiday break, Laura had much more free time to carry out her research. But why Lorraine? Why wasn't her actual name used? She replied to the post asking questions about the poem. It had been posted only a day ago by unknown user, who had a default blank image as their profile. Of course, it wouldn't be that easy, she thought, though she checked later to see if she got a reply. The main esoteric reference to the name Lorraine that Laura found was the Cross of Lorraine, a double-barred cross representing the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The Romans would place a sign across the top of the cross with the crucified person's name for all to see, which gave the cross the appearance of being a double cross. Interesting, thought Laura. This had in fact been the first cross to be used bar the Egyptian ankh, and the Christian cross we are now familiar with apparently didn't come into use until 4 centuries after Christ. A scientific reading of this double cross symbol was that it could very well be in reference to the double helix structure of DNA, or even the XX chromosome of a woman. Another more occult interpretation of the cross of Lorraine that Laura found was that the first crossbar stood for death and the second crossbar stood for life, as in the resurrection of the Christ. The Christ, or Christos, meaning the Anointed One, had its origins in ancient Egypt, which was described here as the land of Kemet. But what did all this mean for Laura? Had Sedgwick in fact died here, crucified by a miserable, joyless existence, and then been reincarnated in another reality? As she scrolled down the page, Laura noticed a link with the title, "Missing Persons Alive and Well in Another Realm." Another coincidence? Many such coincidences had been happening lately, with Laura only having to think of something before immediately receiving some kind of sign from the external world. She clicked on this link and read about people going missing, presumed kidnapped or killed, who had actually stepped from this world into another dimension or plane of reality. As far-fetched as it sounded, Laura read on. A large percentage of the people who go missing every year, many of them young, are often assumed to have been abducted by human traffickers and sold into the global slavery system. Many such sources have argued that this system simply could not function so effectively and efficiently without the tacit complicity of the elite power structure. While there is much truth to this, as recent scandals involving members of the British royal family and disgraced American billionaires have clearly demonstrated to anyone with an ounce of common sense, it does not account for literally millions of people who have simply left this reality and rematerialized in another one. Evidence for this is found in the testimonies of hundreds of thousands of distressed friends and relatives of missing persons, who state that these persons contact them frequently to reassure them that they are okay. Such communications are deemed by critics of the idea as merely the wishful thinking of people traumatized by their loss and need for closure. Laura decided to take a break. She had been reading all evening. She felt like a cigarette, but had not smoked for 11 days now, which in only half an hour would be 12. She wasn't about to spoil this immaculate record now, so she sipped on some green tea instead, while considering what all this new information really meant. The more answers she got, the more questions she had. These people communicating from other dimensions, if this was so, why were they chosen in particular? In the case of Sedgwick, the poem made it clear that he was in a better place now than he had been before. She reflected on Sedgwick. Was he a good person? Laura didn't remember him being particularly religious or pious. He seemed quiet. Truth is, apart from that, she never knew much about Sedgwick at all. He came into work late, said little to anyone for the whole day, and left as soon as the clock struck 5. The only real emotion she felt towards Sedgwick, while being his supervisor, was annoyance for his late starts, his days off sick, and his general, casual attitude towards his work. In retrospect, no one in the office really took to him. Since he didn't join in with all that office banter and politics, most, if not all, kept their distance and barely acknowledged him. It seemed only a matter of time before he failed his probationary so that management could let him go. Laura realized now that to Sedgwick, she too had been a part of this negative, unwelcoming atmosphere. She had not intended to be such, but she had not made any real effort to be anything else. Who knows what may have been going on for him in his life, with his health, or at home? No one ever thought to inquire. Whomever wears the robe shall rule over the whole of the earth. But what if that's not your thing? What if you don't desire to rule over anything? Cedric, the meek shall inherit the earth. For sake of argument, if Leopold wasn't a real person, then perhaps this document she was reading now was one she wrote at an earlier date and uploaded to the site as an anonymous user, knowing she would finally look on here for answers. But why would she do this? Did she know something deep inside herself that she wasn't aware of consciously? Was this all some elaborate adventure that some submerged, advanced part of Laura's psyche had created for herself to experience? To remind herself, perhaps, of what she's really capable of? Were the nurses being sincere when they looked into her eyes and told her that they didn't know of anyone by the name of Leopold who was staying at the Grove? Or was this all some nefarious, sinister cover-up by the elite that we hear so much about, of which stories are summarily dismissed as the cooked-up fictions of conspiracy theorists? Reality and illusion seemed to Laura to be two sides of the same coin. She knew in her heart, though, that she would find the truth one day, in this life or in another, in this dimension or in another. End of The Golden Robe, written and read by Julian Brown.